I'm Chance Dorland, and this is In-Depth, an interview program from expressnews.com where you can find in-depth reporting and other resources concerning every topic you'll hear discussed on the podcast. This week, former Presidio County Sheriff Rick Thompson has been released from a halfway house as part of his journey from being released from prison. For anyone under a certain age, the name may not ring a bell, but for others, his name will recall memories of his downfall back in the early 1990s. And I'm joined now by San Antonio Express News reporter John MacCormack, who was reporting back around this time in 1991 when all this happened. So, John, great to have you on the program. Let's, of course, start with what got this county sheriff, Rick Thompson, in prison in the first place in what, at the time, was an enormous downfall, fall from grace for someone who was trusted with protecting the public.
Well, in December of 1991, I think it was December 4th, federal agents discovered more than a ton of high-grade cocaine in a horse trailer at the Presidio County Fairgrounds, and it was a horse trailer that belonged to the county, and they very quickly linked Rick Thompson to this enormous load of cocaine. And that was the beginning of his downfall. Initially, he claimed that it was a one-man sting, which was not met with much credibility anywhere. Eventually, he pled guilty to smuggling cocaine and he was sentenced to 2 life terms in prison, no chance of parole.
So let's talk about how this happened. We've just described what happened, but obviously, a county sheriff in Texas, this is not something you would normally suspect would be taking place. So how did this all happen? I mean, I grew up in the Midwest, and I actually, when I was growing up, I heard of police officers who got involved with crime for one reason or another, and then they had this large fall from grace. But this is, a county sheriff. This is someone who not only should have known better, but someone who was well aware of the consequences of this type of behavior. So what can you tell me about what led to this occurrence to take place?
Well, Rick Thompson joined the Presidio County Sheriff's Department in the 70s as a deputy. He became the sheriff when the incumbent was murdered, and he served 4 terms. And Presidio County is about 3,800 square miles. It's got 150 miles or more of border with Mexico. And at the time, there were only a sheriff and 2 deputies to patrol it all. And somewhere along the line, Rick Thompson apparently went dirty. And there were rumors as far back as the late 70s, but most people didn't believe him. He had a very peculiar relationship with a man named Glenn Robert Chambers, who was a known dope smuggler and a violent man, and he and Thompson were close. Rick used him as a confidential informant and also intervened for him in Chambers' legal problems. But at the case that put him in prison occurred when an informant who was working for Mr. Chambers in moving this ton of dope across the border with a destination in Houston told the DEA about what was happening, and they discovered, to their surprise, I assume, that Rick Thompson was playing an integral role in the scheme to move this 1 ton of dope worth about $50 million from Mexico across the river to Marfa and then east to San Antonio or Houston. How it happened, why it happened, only Rick Thompson knows. It's worth noting that he was paid slightly under $23,000 to be sheriff and tax assessor collector that year, and that according to the DEA, he would have been paid $500,000 if he could get the cocaine from Marfa to San Antonio. Nevertheless, he was highly respected as a lawman. He had been the president of the Sheriff's Association of Texas. He had done public service announcements for the U.S. Customs, anti-drug spots, and his implication and the subsequent guilty plea were shattering to the community and to many people who had trusted him, many people particularly in law enforcement.
And as you mentioned, these drugs, they were found in a trailer. So let's talk about the discovery. How was this information obtained? How did police know to find this trailer and that there would probably be something inside of it?
Well, the police had someone, had an informant who was working for Robert Chambers. The informant participated in the transfer of the ton of cocaine across the U.S.-Mexico border from a place called San Antonio del Bravo to a place near Candelaria, and it was then subsequently taken to Marfa. And the informant was in touch with the DEA along these various steps of the way. The informant was supposed to drive the horse trailer of cocaine to San Antonio, and when he was able, he told the DEA that the cocaine was in Marfa, and that the number he had been given to call to check as to whether it was ready to drive was the sheriff's home number. The informant also told the DEA that at one point, when Robert Chambers was moving the cocaine around near the border, his pickup truck loaded with cocaine had stalled, and Rick Thompson had showed up and given him a jump. So the DEA knew that Rick Thompson was implicated as they staked out the trailer and eventually seized it.
And we're going to mention this here in a moment, how a change in sentencing laws has led now to the release of former Presidio County Sheriff Rick Thompson. But I want to know more about your history related to this case, John. You've been working as a reporter for quite some time for not just the San Antonio Express-News, but for different organizations as you go back in time. You were somewhat connected to this story in its early formation back in 1991. Could you tell me about that?
Yeah, by a bad stroke of timing, my paper at the time, the Dallas Times-Herald, went under right about the time that Rick Thompson was implicated in this cocaine load. And I knew Rick Thompson a little bit. I didn't find him a very helpful person. He was kind of cocky, and he didn't care about making the press happy. So when I heard about this bust after my paper, just days after my paper had gone under, I kind of had to do the right thing and call my erstwhile competitor, Maggie Rivas, who worked for the Dallas Morning News in El Paso, and say, "Hey, Maggie, you better get to Marfa. There's a huge case here." And so I kind of had my eye on this whole thing for, 26 years. And when I learned last year that the sheriff was going to be released, I kind of decided I should write a story, wrapping it all up, and because most people had lost interest, but I still had a high level of interest.
And so that story is something that you can check out now at expressnews.com. And let's talk about now, John, how this story even is something that we're kind of rehashing at the Express News. Tell me about this change in federal sentencing laws that has made the release of former Presidio County Sheriff Rick Thompson possible. Because as you mentioned, his original sentencing, you would think, would have prevented his release, but I guess that's not the case.
Yeah, there's a couple of interesting wrinkles to the sentencing. Rick Thompson pled guilty in a sealed plea bargain back in 1991, and it was eventually forced public by the Dallas Morning News, which filed a lawsuit. And when everybody read it, they saw that he had admitted to all these things, and that it was learned the prosecutors had agreed to recommend a sentence of 10 years to the judge. Well, when the sentencing came, the judge saw things differently, and he gave Mr. Thompson 2 life terms without any chance of parole, which means you die in prison. Somewhere in the last, I think, 5 or 6 years, there was a change in federal sentencing guidelines, and retroactively it allowed Rick Thompson to apply for parole. And so he served 26 years, I think. I think he would have gotten a 30-year sentence or something like that if the current sentencing guidelines had been in effect when he was sentenced. But the upshot of it was he was a model inmate. He learned everything from Spanish to, automotive repair. I can't remember. There's a really long list. He was a perfect inmate, and he was eligible for parole. And the judge last year granted him parole. And the effective date, I think, was earlier this week. He's been in a halfway house in Midland for a while now where he has family. So I think on the 18th of April, he walked out a free man.
Has there been any contact with former Presidio County Sheriff Rick Thompson? Has he spoken to any media, or is there anything else that you can say about what his life will be like now? Obviously, he wasn't just released from, the gates of the prison, as you mentioned, a halfway house. So there's a little bit of a process in place, as there should be, to try to continue the rehabilitation of someone who's been in prison, but also facilitate as easy as possible a transition from prison life to now being, if you will, a civilian with having all the rights and privileges and responsibilities that we all live with in our everyday lives.
Well, Rick Thompson did not respond to a letter I wrote him maybe 3 or 4 months ago while he was in prison, explaining that I was writing a story and if he wanted to say anything or be interviewed or anything. So he just avoided it. And another reporter had the same result. So I respect his privacy. He lost a third of his life in federal prison because of this thing. And while he's paid his debt to society, even though I don't think anyone in law enforcement will ever forgive him. So as best I understand it, he has family members in Midland who have a business, and he intends to somehow participate in that. But I've respected his privacy. When he made it clear he didn't want to speak to me, I didn't come knocking on his door, because he's got that right as well to say no thank you.
And then, as you mentioned, John, this is something that was a big piece of news when it originally happened back in 1991, and of course now is being reported on because the former Presidio County sheriff who pled guilty to drug crimes has been released after a couple decades in prison. But as you mentioned, this really wasn't a story while he was in federal custody. He was a model prisoner. That's how you described him, correct?
Correct. Yeah, there was Rick Thompson went to prison, and everything died down, and there was kind of radio silence in the press for 25 years. And then last year it was learned he was going to be released. And of course there was some interest, but to be truthful, 26 years is a long time in the news business. And there aren't that many people outside of law enforcement who are particularly interested in this. And there's a lot of people in Marfa who never heard of him. The time when this mattered was when he was implicated in this, the effect it had on Marfa and, of course, his family, because there's two ladies that wrote a history of Presidio and Marfa, Presidio County and Marfa, and in their history book of the community, they went to great lengths to emphasize the traumatic effect this had on the community who had great faith and trusted Rick Thompson. I mean, they called him the walking tall sheriff because he was literally really tall, and he was, he was the law of the land, and he was trusted. And so it was extremely upsetting to the community. A lot of law enforcement people initially came out for him. There was a letter writing campaigns, and so when he pled guilty, I mean that inflicted a huge psychological blow on the community. The man they had trusted, in fact, had sold his badge for drug money. So since then, it's all kind of ebbed, and there's not many people left in Marfa who actually knew him or anything like that. So all the news kind of was in 1991, and now there's just another little look back right now when he's released, and people look back on it because to this day, to my knowledge, there's never been a drug bust of this size or a law enforcement official involved in a case this prominent in Texas, where basically you betrayed the badge.
What you just mentioned now about how it affected the community and how it really gave a black eye to law enforcement, and particularly, of course, former Presidio County Sheriff Rick Thompson, that that mistrust that was played onto the people that knew him and he had been sworn to protect. I'm wondering, are you aware of how this might have changed law enforcement either in the area or in Texas itself? As you mentioned, there hasn't been another bust this size since 1991. Was that perhaps by design? Were changes made to prevent this type of thing from taking place in the future? How do you think this affected law enforcement post-1991?
Well, I don't think you could make changes to prevent a crooked person in a position of opportunity from going bad. I mean, but it's certainly every cop on the border knows that Rick Thompson, it seemed was going away for life for getting involved with drug smugglers. So I'm sure it was a slight deterrent, but essentially that people go bad, go crooked for individual reasons, not because of. I mean, you can't legislate good behavior within the law. The law enforcement saw it as a, he made a comment once, and I don't have it in front of me, but it was something to the effect of cops and crooks are basically the same. The only difference is the cops have a badge. And that's really a wounding comment. He made it at the time he was, still free. It's a very wounding comment if you happen to be a law enforcement agent on the border, that the only difference between you and the bad guys is that you're wearing a badge. So as far as any institutional or policy changes, I don't think they can be made to prevent this from happening again. In this era right now, there's many, many, many more times federal agents, the DEA, the Border Patrol, Homeland Security, on the border. So it's not going to happen again the way it happened then when the Border Patrol was undermanned. The border was much more wide open. I mean, they could ship a ton of cocaine across, just by driving across a low water crossing. That can't happen really anymore. So you'll never find this exact kind of components again. But anytime there's opportunity and money and you got a person with, susceptible, that people can still be corrupted. Not on this scale, though, in my opinion.
And then finally, John, before we say goodbye, just have a few moments left. Final thoughts on this story. And it's so interesting to speak with you because, as you mentioned, you weren't able to specifically report on this because the newspaper you're working for shut down right around this time. But you were obviously there, and you've been following, I guess you could say, kind of the lack of news regarding Rick Thompson because he was a model prisoner for so long. But then now we're talking about it once again in 2018, so long afterwards because, surprise, surprise, laws changed. And, former Presidio County Sheriff Rick Thompson has now been released from his halfway house, and he's making that adjustment to life after prison, which I can only imagine must be a very difficult adjustment to be going through. So final thoughts, John, before we say goodbye on this topic that, once again, as I started our discussion off with, some people may have never heard of Rick Thompson, and for others, this may be quite a jolt back to 1991 to this real tragedy involving law enforcement.
Yeah, the real tragedy, in my opinion, was the effect this had on first the community and secondarily on his family. He had 3 kids, one of whom was still at home. And, he's paid his debt to society, but he lost 26 years with his family. So, you can't fix that, and you can't fix the effect it had on Marfa, So, it's just a very sad, tragic tale. I don't know why it happened. He was only paid $23,000 a year to be sheriff in 1991. And he went for the dirty money. A lot of other sheriffs and law enforcement were paid that much or less, so that's not an excuse. But I guess just Rick Thompson, I guess he just went down the slippery slope, According to the DEA, he started out by giving Mr. Chambers information about where the law enforcement was when Mr. Chambers wanted to smuggle drugs in. Then he helped out with some loads, and then he ended up with a ton of cocaine in his lap, and he got, 26 years in prison. So I don't know that there's any moral to the story other than, human frailty is ever with us.
And you can read more about this update to this original crime that was uncovered back in 1991 by visiting expressnews.com. And I've been speaking with San Antonio Express News reporter John MacCormack with this kind of revisitation from back when I was just a young lad growing up in the Midwest. But I don't want to go into details, but I actually have a very close friend growing up whose father was a law enforcement officer who had a similar fall from grace. So this story is very interesting to me, and I think anyone could find a lot in this story just because of the tragedy that you've described. So John, thank you for joining me today on the In-Depth podcast.
You're welcome.
And a big thank you for the history lesson from San Antonio Express News reporter John MacCormack, and of course for joining me for today's episode of In-Depth, an interview program from expressnews.com. For the San Antonio Express News, I'm Chance Dorland.